Hello, welcome to This Week's World, tasked with turning your gentle Saturday tea time into something of a meaty doorstopper sandwich of ideas to chew on. We'll be looking at the parrot, who could be a vital witness to murder, the footballing nations you'll never find in the Euros, and in the week ABBA reformed, we've been to Sweden, all that to come. But this week we turn the spotlight on Saudi Arabia. Do we like doing business with the kingdom? How comfortable are we having them as allies? From increased executions to a tanking economy under a new king, it's been a remarkable year in Saudi. We report from there and ask if we can believe its promises to reform. Plus, how does Kim Jong-un of North Korea get the money to bankroll all those nuclear tests? We meet the foreign businessmen who keep him in business. Before that, what other stories have made the week? Here are ours. On show 5 of This Week's World, it's time for a week in numbers. 14,000, that's the sum of mourners at Muhammad Ali's funeral. 20 minutes of action. That's how the father of this Stanford student referred to his son's criminal behaviour after he was convicted of rape. Cue global outrage with both father and son.
When the sentencing came out, people lost faith in the legal system.
6-5, the penalty score that hailed Abkhazia as victors in the unrecognised states of the World Cup. Forget the Euros, these are the ones that really count. 40,000, the number of people London's first naked restaurant claims are on its waiting list. Diners are told to liberate themselves by leaving their clothes at home. It opens tonight. 5, the number of times a Michigan man was shot, possibly by his wife. The witness, his pet parrot, Bud, who can't stop repeating his last words. Now the family want the parrot on the witness stand. Well, our panellists today are Emma Barnett. She's been tech and women's editor at the Daily Telegraph and will soon be hosting a daily daytime show on Radio 5 Live. Congratulations, Emma. Nice to see you. With her, the novelist Tamima Anam. Hello to you both. Hello. You're going to start us off. Tamima, burn of the week. Just talk us through this one.
Well, Bernie Sanders is now effectively having to drop out of the Democratic presidential nomination. Hillary has declared herself and has been declared the nominee. I don't think that he's burned out. I was a huge Bernie supporter. I think he's made a huge impact on American politics. I think it was great to have a conversation that was so anti-Trump, but also that he was from outside the establishment.
It was quite anti-Hillary as well at parts, wasn't it?
Yes. It was. I think that now is the time for people to rally behind Hillary.
But she's had to really go for this moment of, this is a moment for women, you know, even if she doesn't want to do that, because part of being the first woman to go for this office is that you have to own that, but at the same time be like, I'm the candidate, never mind my gender. And she can't sort of win, I feel. You've got these columnists and people writing saying, how can she be one of the people when she's wearing a $12,000 Armani jacket? Well, when she looks like rubbish, they say we can't vote for her because she doesn't look right. And I think all the time, her gender is a big factor and often against her. A few days ago, she went on the Ellen DeGeneres show to show her warm and buttery side with pre-planned photos of her grandchild, talking about how she used to sing to her own daughter, Chelsea. And it just makes you want to be sick. I mean, I don't know how you feel about it, because I don't need my politicians to be warm or to look good. I just need them to be good at politics.
Well, I think that there is a lot of sexism in the way that Hillary's talked about, absolutely. But I do think there is an authenticity problem. I think that she is read as being a kind of product of the political machinery, for better or for worse. And I think she's really going to have to address that if she's going to beat Donald Trump.
Talking of sort of strong character centre stage, it's quite interesting to see what in Turkey Erdogan's doing now, this sort of, you know, big fanfare of who he is.
Absolutely. I think Erdogan's trying to promote himself as some kind of pan-Islamic leader. I mean, you'll note that he was supposed to speak at Muhammad Ali's funeral, but has now been uninvited. And partly that's maybe because of the sexist comments that he made last week about, you know, a woman being incomplete if she chooses to work rather than have children.
I'm incomplete as of yet.
Well,
I don't have kids yet.
We'll let you on the show this week.
Thank you. I'll work on it.
Tamima, whitewash of the week. This involves what, the Rumi rumours.
That's correct. So the writer of the Gladiator film wants to make a film about Jalaluddin Rumi, who's the 13th century Persian poet. but he has claimed that he would like to cast Leonardo DiCaprio as Rumi and Robert Downey Jr. as Shams al-Tabriz, who was Rumi's mentor. So obviously, people are outraged about this.
The most un-Persian characters you can possibly imagine.
Well, because they're white, and one of them is Iron Man. So really, people are outraged about this. It's typical Hollywood whitewashing. This isn't just a story that he has written, a fictional story. This is an actual historical figure, a poet that is revered throughout history and all over the world. He is known to be like the most popular poet in the United States. And he claims that he wants to do this to, sort of change stereotypes about Muslims. But to do this by casting two white actors as the main characters seems really kind of pointless.
And if he was just seeking the publicity, he's probably got it now.
That's
Emma.
true.
Last word to you, Emma. Holiday snap of the week.
Yes, well, there are three guys who are in Ayia Napa, and they put online that they had got a bit misguided in their trip on a boat and had ended up in Syria because they took some photos in front of some graffitied walls. And a few media outlets fell for this, saying this was the big boat trip that went wrong. Turns out they were drunk. They were having a laugh. It came out on Facebook. This was a complete prank. And, at a time, not to be joyless, good for them, they made all the headlines for the wrong reasons. But I suppose at a time when we are dealing with an unusual amount of displaced people, especially from, those parts of the world which are suffering immensely, it wasn't the coolest prank, shall we say.
So many people have died trying to get here. To imagine that one would just fall asleep and wake up in Syria is absolutely ludicrous.
From
How
Ayia
could
Napa.
they believe that?
Well, there you go. Stranger things have happened on the internet.
I guess so.
Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming in. Now, Saudi Arabia is facing allegations this week. It bullied and blackmailed the UN until it was removed from a human rights blacklist. But it's also a country in the midst of massive political, economic change. A country made rich on oil may now have to rethink its future without that wealth. And it's a country fighting a war in Yemen. Just over a year ago, a new king was crowned. Have a look at what happened inside Saudi since. The economy's tanked, shown in falling government revenues from oil, and at the same time, the number of people thought to be executed in the kingdom has risen dramatically. We dedicate much of this edition of This Week's World to exploring Saudi and its relations with the West. The Deputy Crown Prince has laid out his vision of economic reform, but political repression is on the up. Saudi journalist Safa Al-Ahmed looks at what the government's doing to crack down on dissent.
Silence is safer than speaking out. It's a lesson you learn quickly in Saudi Arabia. Protests are illegal. Political dissent is illegal. To be publicly critical of the Saudi government can land you in jail. Or worse. In the past year, the government has become even more oppressive.
القضاء في المملكة العربية السعودية أصبح هو الأداة وهو السلاح التي تستخدمه الحكومة لقمع وإسكات الأصوات المخالفة والآراء الأخرى مهما كان التوجه.
Taha has represented some of the most high-profile political cases in Saudi. Most notably, Nimr al-Nimr, who was executed on January 2nd, among 47 others. Al-Nimr's nephew Ali was arrested when he was 17 years old and now awaits execution.
Since the beginning of 2016, there were the executions of 47 people. And all of these cases, I could guarantee, as a lawyer, there were no due process, regardless of if these people have done something wrong or not.
Abdul Aziz represented some of the most iconic Saudi political dissidents.
The message, at least to me, is clear. Is regardless of where you come from in Saudi Arabia and what is your background, what is your ideology, and if you are from the majority or the minority, if you oppose the government, you might face this end.
Many of the 47 cases were held in what is called the Specialized Criminal Court.
دور المحامي في المحكمة الجزائية المتخصصة هو الدور تجميلي فقط. يحاكم الجميع كالإرهابيين في هذه المحكمة.
The job for this specialized criminal court is to make anyone guilty, regardless of who is he. So if the Minister of Interior himself has been sent to this specialized criminal court, he will be found guilty.
One of those found guilty by the court and executed was a minor. It is a clear violation of Saudi Arabia's obligations under international law.
عندنا مثل واضح جدا وقاسي جدا في نفس الوقت، إعدام علي الربح. التهم التي وجهت لعلي الربح المشاركة في المظاهرات كان سنها دون 18 في ذلك الحين، لكن محاكمته تمت بعدها بسنوات.
Not only minors are put in jail, even the elderly have not been spared. Sheikh Suleiman al-Rushudi, who was a judge for 2 decades, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the crime of breaking allegiance with the king. His lawyer Abdulaziz has also paid a high price.
2 days after the government sent 2 of my clients to prison, they went after me directly. So I had to decide between prison and exile. I believed that I will be more useful in exile than in prison, just simply as that.
Abdulaziz and Taha are among many who ended up taking the path of exile rather than be silenced in Saudi jails.
Well, it's not just human rights inside the country. This week, the UN included Saudi on its list of government forces blacklisted for causing the death of children in Yemen, and then appeared to row back under pressure, the suspicion is, from Saudi and its Gulf allies, and took it off again. Public outrage towards the country and its human rights stance is growing, and governments around the world are now reacting to that. I went to Sweden, which embraces a self-styled feminist foreign policy, and spoke to the Foreign Secretary and former EU Commissioner Margot Wallström, slapped down by Riyadh last year after referring to Saudi punishments as medieval.
I was not the only one who criticised the flogging of a blogger. And I think that it has to be seen in a context of a long history also the previous Swedish government had with Saudi Arabia over weapons export. And I think that gave us a particular role. So of course that criticism I think also hurt the more and was felt the more. So they took their ambassador home, and also I had been invited to give a speech in Cairo. Then Saudi Arabia did not want me to give my speech there. Turned into a spat. And they know very well what we think about democracy and human rights. But we also need to have diplomatic and political and economic ties, because we believe in free trade and open economic contacts also between our countries.
In terms of the sale of arms from Sweden to Saudi Arabia, are you happy to see that continue?
We are now introducing also a much stricter regulation and laws on trading with weapons, so there will be a criterion of democracy in our legislation. This will also mean that we have new restrictions or new requirements for entering into trade deals, also with countries that might have a problem living up to the democratic criteria. I think the world needs to, and especially the European Union, has to come back to the fact that we are a value-based union, that this is where it has all started. We believe in human rights and democracy. I think this is the problem, that today this has been pushed aside. I think that the national interests and the economic interests tend to take over.
£900 million worth of trade between Saudi and Sweden. Does that strike you as the right number?
No, we believe in free trade. We believe that the economic contexts are good. So I think Swedish companies know that they can invest in Saudi Arabia, and I believe it's good to have trade.
So if people said, a year ago, here was this strong voice, criticising human rights, cutting short the arms deal at the time, and really making Saudi Arabia know how you felt about it, and a year later it seems to be normalised. Does it feel like
No, they know where we stand. We have made our points and we have not made any excuses. They know very well what we think.
But it feels like you're rowing back now, or that you're worried about trade.
No, I'm not at all. I was not worried about it at the time either. We have always had a trade with Saudi Arabia, but the military agreement was finished, and that is of course also a sign, and they know that we will have a much stricter regulation when it comes to trading with countries that are not democracies.
You've implemented famously in this government a feminist foreign policy. What does that mean to you? How does that change how you make decisions?
It means that we define it as a peace and security issue. I think it is everywhere a very welcome policy, and not that difficult, because if you put those lenses on, you will see the world also from a women's perspective, and you will see that there is still so much of discrimination and violence against women everywhere, and we have to change that.
Margaret Wallström in Stockholm. Well, the falling price of oil and massive government expenditures making Saudi redesign its entire economy before crisis sets in. Oil accounts for some 70% of government revenue. If prices don't recover, the IMF's predicting the country could be bankrupt within 5 years. This week, the Saudi cabinet formally ratified Vision 2030, the Deputy Crown Prince's idea of a country's post-oil plan. But here's one man's story.
اسمي زيد السهلي، تخرجت من جامعة الملك سعود، تخصص هندسة بترول وغاز طبيعي، طبعا بكالوريوس. استلمنا الشهادة، بدأت الفرحة تنزل تنزل تنزل. بعد شهر خلاص بديت تحس انك nothing، يعني لازم يا تكون حصلت وظيفة او انك تكون نايم في البيت 24 ساعة. جت أزمة النفط وهبوط أسعار النفط وكذا، تفاجأت إنه في بعض الشركات لما أروح أقدم له يقول إحنا أصلاً قاعدين نستغني عن موظفين. بصراحة يعني بجاحة، أنت جاي تطلب وظيفة، يعني المفروض إنك خلاص تستحي على دمك وتمشي أصلاً. قدمت تقريبا على أكثر من 70-80 شركة ويب سايت، هذه في البداية 150 200 تقريبا في الرينج هذا، 200 إيميل موجود فيه السي في وكل بياناتي وكل مؤهلاتي، ولا جاني أي رد. هنا أنا حاط عندي في الخريطة الشركات معطيها الستار هذا. قلت أنا أكسر المود، ليش ما أداهم الشركات بنفسي؟ أنا أدخل لهم وأقول لهم أنا موجود، هذا السي في حقي، هذه مؤهلاتي، هذه خبراتي، وظفوني. الشركة هذه شركة بترولية صح؟ في المكتب HR هنا، موارد بشرية. طموحي صراحة الرئيسي إني أحصل وظيفة، لكن طموحي اللي أكبر من الطموح الرئيسي إني أوصل للموارد البشرية في شركة من الشركات. أنا ما قادر أقابلهم أصلاً، أنا أقابلهم عند السكيورتي. طيب HR is here or HR where? تحس إنه في قصورهم العالية لازم تطلع لهم تتسلق لهم كذا. كنت أتردد بين الرياض والشرقية، كل ما جاء معرض توظيف والحاجات هذه في النهاية ما في وظائف، حتى لما تحضر له تسأله يقول لك ما في شواغر الآن. لدرجة أنه في واحد من الطلاب وصل على التواصل الاجتماعي مقطع وهو يحرق شهادة بكالوريوس طب أسنان، والسبب أنه ما كان له وظيفة.
وحنثرها للريح.
بالنسبة لي أنا في تقريبا الآن تقريبا سنة وشهرين هذه في العطالة، يعني خبرة حلوة. كل ما تجوع أكل خيار. والله بالنسبة لي أنا لو بتسأليني على بكرة أقول لك ما مستعد. لأني مو لاقي وظيفة أصلاً، مو لاقي شيء أضمن وأقول والله أنا عندي مستقبل، عندي كذا. أنا المصيبة إنه ما في مستقبل أصلاً.
Well, Safar Al-Ahmed is back with us now, and Safar's worked extensively in the region and in Yemen. I mentioned that political economic plan they call Vision 2030. Do you think there's reason to feel optimistic or worried about Saudi now?
Sadly, I'm very worried and pessimistic, especially in light of what was lacking in the Vision 2030. A lot of people before it came out were looking forward to the vision, including political reform. The focus in the Vision 2030 was purely economical, with a little bit of social reform. The challenges economically inside the country, the rate of unemployment, all these things have been going on for several years now, so that's not new. But what has dramatically put a lot of pressure on the economy has been the year of war on Yemen, and we are not quite sure when that is going to end. There are no rights inside Saudi Arabia to criticize the war, to question if we should even be in this war, how much money is being spent on this war. So both the economic and the political questions inside the country and externally are quite important at the moment.
Safa, thank you very much. Fahad Nazar was at the Saudi embassy in Washington. He's just returned from Riyadh. Fahad Nazar, thanks for joining us here. Let's start with those allegations, shall we, of bullying, threats, pressure, even blackmail against the UN after it placed Saudi on its human rights blacklist for violations in Yemen. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's understandable that the Saudis objected to essentially being put lumped in the same list with the Houthis. I think that it is well documented that the Houthis, and for many years, have used child soldiers. They have targeted schools and hospitals and other civilian targets.
Allegations from
Yemen.
the UN, though, of pressure, of bribery, of blackmail, even the mention of a fatwa against the UN for not understanding the Muslim world. Where does that come from? Is that really how Saudi Arabia would behave in this situation?
From the perspective of Saudi Arabia, they feel that that the criticism that has been leveled against them by the international community has been unfair and one-sided. But the reality was that Yemen was, in fact, slowly but surely heading towards yet another civil war. And as the Saudis have maintained, I think they make a compelling case that they went to war in Yemen out of necessity. It wasn't a war of choice. That they had not just one, but two militant organizations. The international community, frankly, did not show any interest in getting involved in Yemen. So the Saudis took this as a last resort, I think, in many ways.
Reports found 32 airstrikes in Yemen violated international humanitarian law. 361 civilians killed. 127 of those were children.
Right. I think the Saudis acknowledge that some mistakes have been made, but the argument that the Saudis are targeting civilian centers and populations as a matter of policy is not accurate. Keep in mind, this is a 10-member coalition that does have the support of both the United States and the United Kingdom.
The problem is when the world looks at what's happening in Saudi and then it hears stories of how the government within the country has become more repressive, the way that lawyers are choosing exile over prison, the way political dissent is being shut down, the way that numbers of being executed are going up, it doesn't sound like a country that's trying very hard to reform right now.
If one looks at what has happened in Saudi Arabia over the past 30 years, not the past 2 weeks or past 2 months, I think the country has taken some important steps towards political reform. It's created a consultative Shura Council that was initially composed of 60 members, now is composed of 150 members, including 30 women. The Saudis also created a Human Rights Commission. Obviously, there's more that needs to be done there, but I think they've made a concerted and, frankly, a sincere effort to push these reforms forward.
So how do you explain then the execution of dissident minors or the imprisonment of an elderly judge?
Again, I think that there's the focus on a handful of high-profile cases. I think it gives a somewhat distorted view of what is going on in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a country of 30 million people. It's a little disheartening to hear some of the reporting in the West. I would not put Saudi Arabia, in the same light as North Korea or Syria or Iran, to be honest.
In terms of trade, you heard Sweden there considering its future in terms of arms deals with Saudi. If Britain or America or Sweden stop selling arms to Saudi, what difference do you think that would make?
Well, I don't think any of those the countries you mentioned have any intentions of doing so. The Obama administration has pushed through almost $100 billion worth of weapons deals over the past few years. There's also a lot of military cooperation between Saudi Arabia and the United States and the UK and other countries. And I think these relations, like I said, are long-standing, and I think they're mutually beneficial in many ways.
I'm just going to go back to Safa. You heard Fahad Nazar's point there that sometimes the West highlights these incidents of a few high-profile cases, and there are 30 million people in that country. Do you want to respond?
I think choosing these really high-profile cases is symbolic and is a message to the inside that if you do and continue to politically dissent against the government, this can happen to you as well. So regardless of how the West covers it or not, that to me personally is irrelevant. It's the message internally, as in this is the method you use to silence people. There is no system where the people can directly impact government policy.
Essentially no democracy. Fahad Nazar, would you like to have the last word on that?
I think the Shura Council, many ways, does not get enough credit. I think that over the years, not only has its membership increased, but I think it's become more representative. Its membership represents every single region of the country, and I think there are more and more avenues open to average citizens to have a say in the political decision-making process.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for joining us here on This Week's World. Now it's time for Think Again, our regular strand of bite-sized ideas. George Bush famously called Africa a country. Now meet the blogger in Botswana who, weirdly, thinks he might have been onto something.
Africa. I'm hoping that you know that it's not just one giant Africa-shaped country. Okay, good. Africa is 54 separate countries and over 1 billion people. But historically, it's not been that unified. For example, not many people in my country, Botswana, know what's happening in Guinea or Morocco or where? Last century, Black intellectuals like Ghana's independence leader Kwame Nkrumah founded Pan-Africanism, a desire for political African unity. It kind of just ended up being a bunch of leaders high-fiving each other in conference rooms. It didn't really mean very much for ordinary Africans. Now, though, we're seeing a new wave of Pan-Africanism. I call it social Pan-Africanism. The internet now has given Africans a tool to unite in ways that we never could before. From the comfort of our own countries, we can now support South African students fighting for cheaper fees, Zimbabwean women who are marching to parliament, And we can also support Angolan journalists who just want to do their job. We can swap ideas. And my dream is that young Africans can begin to rescue each other and ultimately to rescue ourselves.
Now, how does North Korea make its money? The country is under heavy economic sanctions aimed at its nuclear program. But in fact, its leader, 32-year-old Kim Jong-un, has found various still legal ways of trading with international investors. The US Treasury is so worried about this trade that it's just decided to increase penalties on all banks that do any trade with Pyongyang. But a small group of Western businessmen are quite happy to carry on trading with North Korea, unconcerned by the ethics. We've met them.
Making money is the main reason.
We focused on, building relationships.
People who've taken part in our workshops have set up essentially big convenience stores. Actually doing business in North Korea is quite tricky. You have to make sure you're not violating UN sanctions. If you're from a country like the US or Australia, you have to make sure you're not violating your own country's sanctions. And so, for the vast majority of Western business people, you look at all those things and you think, well, not now.
People are afraid of doing business with North Korea. You have to do your homework, but in reality, sanctions do not hamper most of our business.
I think before walking into any country and doing business, you need to know a little bit about their history, about, religion or beliefs or ethics.
In North Korea, technically everything is state-owned, so there's no legal room for someone to own their own company. But under Kim Jong-un, they've experimented with having more companies run not on a state plan, but along what we think of as market principles.
When you read about Pyongyang nowadays, some people are referring to Manhattan, and they call it Pyonghattan.
Now, I've been working with the DPRK for, I think, almost 18 years. It's still necessary often to go in and meet face-to-face to talk about things.
One of the main challenges with North Korea, the companies, they are in general not on the internet. And you need somebody to invite you into North Korea.
There's a lot of limitations on telecoms. So once we leave, you can't WhatsApp or WeChat people. Emails can be difficult. Sometimes you don't get responses for a long time.
Investment has helped the standard of living for people living in the major cities, as development in any country will generally start, but there's also some trickle down into the countryside.
Officially, according to the embargo, we are not allowed to trade champagne with North Korea. But in reality, you can find champagne very easily. So if the elite wants to buy champagne, they can do it. They are not suffering, but the workers are suffering because they have no jobs. And otherwise, without an embargo, they would have jobs.
Overall, for a country like North Korea that is relatively isolated, the more bridges you have, the more connections and links you have to the outside world, the better. I think that's generally true.
You would go to stores maybe 10 years ago and you'd have maybe one variety of some kind of soft drink, and now you go to the department stores and it's filled.
Everybody in Pyongyang seems to have a mobile phone, much more cars, much more restaurants. This is a coffee shop, a joint venture with an Austrian coffee company. They are selling coffees which I never drink. Very strange coffee types.
Joining me in a second, Victor Cha, the former member of the White House National Security Council. Originally from South Korea, Victor Cha became the top advisor on North Korea to President George W. Bush. And you'll remember what he thought.
States like these constitute an axis of evil.
From 2003, Cha represented the US as part of the six-party negotiations, which ultimately failed to stop Pyongyang developing nuclear weapons. North Korea has carried out 4 nuclear tests. It's also developed long-range missiles capable of hitting the US. In March, the leader Kim Jong-un reacted to further UN sanctions by publicly ordering his nukes to be ready for use at any time. Victor Cha, we've spoken to these private individuals, businessmen, doing trade with North Korea.
Well, as long as the companies that we're talking about are not front companies for the revenues from which are used to finance proliferation or human rights abuses, then they're not technically in violation of sanctions or US law for that matter. But in North Korea, the problem is you never know for sure. As the piece said, everything in some way is owned by the state. And you're just never sure what's behind the front door.
This week, we've seen the US Treasury name North Korea as a prime money laundering concern and try and shut down any American bank that is part of that chain. Is that a solution that's going to work?
It's certainly a very decisive and significant measure. Where the impact will be third countries, the Chinese, the Russians, others that do have some business with North Korea and that do face the threat of coming under Treasury sanctions or being excluded from the US financial system.
Historically, we've looked at North Korea's missile tests as a bit of a joke. You know, they don't quite have the range, they don't quite have the expertise. Do you sense that a lot of the worry is for nothing?
I'm much more worried today than I was 5 or 7 years ago. And I think that's generally the view in the expert community now, both in terms of their nuclear weapons programs and the ability to miniaturize a nuclear weapon and put it on a ballistic missile. These are things that are coming very much within North Korea's focus, and they are amassing a significant arsenal.
China is key to all of this. Should China be putting more pressure on North Korea to drop its nuclear deterrent? Is it in that country's interest?
It is certainly China's obligation and responsibility to play a large role in trying to convince North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons program. But certainly they worry about a collapse of the regime that will send refugees across the border. The problem with China has always been, are they willing to squeeze North Korea harder and for longer periods of time? And that has not been the case in the past.
Would you like to see that regime collapse?
Certainly, this is not a regime that makes sense in the 21st century. In the end, I think regimes like this eventually collapse of their own weight. It's certainly not the policy of any country today to try to purposefully collapse North Korea. You know, everybody kind of sits around and waits and watches and tries to defend himself against all the negative externalities of the regime.
Would you accept that sanctions haven't worked? In the last few weeks, we've heard Donald Trump say he'll talk to Kim Jong-un. That's got to be right at this point, hasn't it?
So the problem is not talking with them. The problem now is that they do not want to give up their nuclear weapons program. And the Obama administration has tried. I mean, they have reached agreements with Iran, with Cuba, with Myanmar, Burma. The one outstanding case is North Korea. And it's not because we don't want to talk to them. The problem is they don't want to talk to us. They don't want to talk to the world right now, including China.
Victor Cha, thank you very much. Well, that almost brings us to the end of the programme. But next week, 5 days ahead of the EU referendum, we ask what difference a Brexit would make to the rest of the EU. Margot Wallström, you'll remember from earlier, Sweden's Foreign Secretary, told me it could trigger the beginning of the breakup of the entire European Union.
It will either mean that the UK actually leaves, and that will be the start of a 2-year negotiation. That might affect other EU member states as well, saying, well, if they can leave, maybe we should also have referendums, or maybe we should also leave. Maybe it's better that we leave. Or if they stay, it might also lead to other countries saying, well, they negotiated, they asked and demanded to have a special treatment, so why shouldn't we? And I think it will break up so it will be bad in either way. But of course we are hoping that they will stay.
If the UK leaves,
you think it could start to, trigger the breakup?
I think it will definitely have such an effect. That's a risk of it. That's a risk, absolutely.
There will be loads, of course, who disagree with her. Tune in next Saturday to find out.